Hi, welcome everybody to another week of our lecture series. Yes, we're very glad to be here today because it was quite unsure and we had already cancelled and then we uncancelled. So I'm very glad that people got the note that the lecture takes place today, and we're very glad to have Rachel here. A few organizational matters beforehand. There's a Sommerfest organized by the Fachschaftsinitiative Philosophie next Friday. It's in the afternoon and somewhere on Campus Nord. I'm not quite sure. There's posters hanging around outside. Just if you have some time, there's, I think, going to be a barbecue and stuff to eat. So for a nice end to the semester, you're welcome to join them or us. I don't know. Okay, then the next matter is about Modulbögen, which is not relevant for philosophy students since they are allowed to sign their own transcripts. But for everybody else, I think I'm just going to do that in German. Also nächste Woche könnt ihr die mitbringen, entweder hier direkt Dienstagabend oder auch Mittwoch morgens zum Workshop. Der wird auch nächste Woche wieder um 10 Uhr stattfinden. Dort sind wir auch da zum Unterschreiben. Und wir werden wahrscheinlich noch einen dritten Termin irgendwann eine Woche später anbieten, wo wir dann vielleicht 2 Stunden im PC-Pool oder Fachschaftsraum sind. Das werden wir aber auch nochmal ankündigen. Okay, next up, 2 other pieces of information for tonight. You're welcome to join us at Ziploc afterwards. We're going to go have a drink, talk some more. I think it's going to be really nice, and we're glad that Rachel's going to join us. And tomorrow there's a workshop, this time at 10 a.m., and we're going to read a draft written by Rachel about epistemic violence, allyship, and mobbing. Yes, it's really interesting, and we hope to see many of you there. Okay, now done with that. Just for a short introduction about Rachel. She is Rachel McKinnon. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy at Charleston College. She's trained in the fields of epistemology and language philosophy and deals with issues of gender identity. Currently, she's researching the norms of assertion and works on her second book, Things We Do with Assertions. In addition to that, she is in addition to being an internationally recognized scholar in philosophy and trans issues, she's an internationally competitive cyclist and multiple time state champion in a number of different cycling disciplines. She's co-founder, president and chairwoman of a non-profit organization, Foxy Moxy Racing, which is an international cycling team focused on radically promoting gender-inclusive sport, particularly for trans and gender non-conforming athletes. Her 2018 goals include winning Masters World Championship and Canadian National Championship titles, which she is well on the way to do. Okay, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Can you hear me in the back? Okay, I promised them I was loud enough that I wouldn't have to stand too much with the microphone, partly because I like to wander, and unfortunately the clicker won't fit with this, so I want to be over here. So I'm really happy to be here. Until Thursday afternoon, we didn't think it was going to happen because there's passport issues that I was having, and then I found out Thursday afternoon, I think a day after they had announced the cancellation, that, oh, my passport's going to be here in time, so here I am. Okay, so just to start, this is a project that I've been working on with a friend of mine for a little over a year now. The article for this will be done around November and should be out next year. So this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Erin Conrad. She both has a PhD in philosophy, but she's also a practicing lawyer. So part of what I'm going to be talking about is the ethics around transathletes in sports, the policy decision making, but also the legal landscape for transathlete participation in sports. So it's really useful to have a lawyer as your co-author when you're talking about the legal stuff. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Just a little bit about me, because I approach this both as an athlete, an academic, and an activist. So I'm drawing on these three spheres of experience and expertise in order to do this sort of project. So that's me. Basically, my second but unpaid job is professional cycling because professional women cyclists don't make money. Gender equity, yay. The International Cycling Union does set a minimum pay for men, but not for women. Progressive. So I used to race professionally on the road, and this is me winning a pro race in Georgia. But now I focus on track cycling at the velodrome. So all last June, I was in Pennsylvania doing international races, and this is getting third place. That's the white helmet. In fact, that's the helmet over there, because I brought it here for doing bike rides. And as the introduction, I am a co-founder of this team named Foxy Moxy Racing, where our mission statement is that we race bikes radically promoting trans and gender nonconforming inclusion in sport. We are a team of about 15 cyclists of all genders and gender identities. We have riders in the US, Canada, Wales, England, Australia, and we're still growing. And we do mean radically here. We have no sort of political requirements of our members, and whoever they want to piss off, we're quite happy with. So we're out there racing, we're being activists, we're advocating, and we're sort of just making ourselves visible and welcoming for everybody. So when I say we have all genders on our team, we do include cis people too. So you're welcome to. Okay. So what's the position that I'm going to defend today? Well, what we argue is that the inclusion of trans athletes in competition commensurate with their legally recognized gender is most consistent with the International Olympic Committee and the Court of Arbitration for Sport principles of fair and equitable sport. So that's what we're going to argue. I want to make a really big caveat now, which most people will forget by the time question period starts. This is not what we think is the right position. This is not what we think is ethically most right. This is what we think, given the legal structures of the IOC and recent Court of Arbitration for Sport decisions, is the most plausible that they would agree to. This is not what we think is right. We think that something much more progressive than this is correct. We think self-identification of the athlete is better than legally recognized status. And we're going to talk about why, but this is what we think is most consistent. If a case now were to be brought to the Court of Arbitration for Sport challenging the policies I'm about to talk about, this is what we think they should decide if they're reasonable people. But they're judges, we don't expect them to be reasonable. Okay, so outline. What I'm going to start with is talking about a 2015 decision, the DUTEE Chand case, which was an interim decision regarding intersex athletes. It's an interim decision because they gave the IAAF, the Track and Field Federation, 2 years to submit more data. It's unclear whether they met that deadline, but we're going to talk about the data that they submitted because it's garbage and hilarious. Second, I'm going to talk about gender verification principles after the Chand decision. I'm going to explain what prima facie discrimination is and the human rights framework for how to think about discrimination in international sport. I'm going to take a philosophical detour through the concept of fairness in sport, like what does it mean to be fair in competitive sport? There's going to be some philosophy. And then we end with what we're calling a normative prediction. So what do we think future decisions should be, not what they will be, because judges are imperfect. Okay, so quick little history. So the Court of Arbitration for Sport has its seat in Lausanne, Switzerland. It is, strictly speaking, independent but arm's length of the IOC. So it's created by the IOC, but it's meant to be basically the Supreme Court of sport. So the IOC gives a little control over to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, even though they kind of created it. Okay, so decisions are only reviewed by, since they're in Switzerland, they are to some degree under Swiss law, but they only ever get reviewed if the court screws up too much, and that has never happened yet. Okay, so they're basically their own Supreme Court. If you take a case to CAS and it's denied, tough shit. There are no appeals, basically. It is the Supreme Court, and there have been separate court cases, for example, one in Canada, where a trans woman athlete did not go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. She refused to sign her racer's license and then took them to the Human Rights Court in Canada and won in a mediation. But what happened was CAS and the IOC objected to the Human Rights Court in Canada having jurisdiction, right? Because they really want to be the Supreme Court with nobody giving oversight. So it's kind of messed up. Okay, so a little bit about the Court of Arbitration for Sport jurisdiction. It's mutually agreed party arbitration, and it's basically binding. And for every Olympic sport, when you get your athlete's license, your participation license, they require you to sign an agreement that any dispute will go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Okay? So not every sport is under the auspices of CAS. Every Olympic sport is, because it's a body of the International Olympic Committee. So the way the laws work for CAS is that procedurally they use Swiss law, but substantively they use the IOC Charter and then the law of the nation for which the international sports body is housed. I know, furrow brows, I'll explain. So for example, the International Cycling Union, which is the Union Cycliste Internationale, the UCI, is also in Lausanne, Switzerland. So you use procedurally Swiss law, substantively the IOC Charter, and Swiss law. So about half or so of international sports bodies are in Lausanne. Many of the other ones are in Monaco. So the sports body we're going to be talking about, the IAAF, which is the International Athletics Association Federation or something like that, the IAAF is in Monaco. So in that case, you procedurally use Swiss law, the IOC Charter, and the law of Monaco, which is Monegasque law. Okay, make sense? Okay. It just so happens that like all the sports bodies are in one of two places, but it didn't have to be that way. Now, one of the really interesting things about the Court of Arbitration for Sport is because it's an arbitral body, it does not, strictly speaking, set precedent. So previous decisions are meant to be persuasive for future decisions, but are not binding. So they can decide one way in one case, and then you have a very similar case brought later, and they just completely change their mind. They could do that. They really try not to. Also, that would probably be grounds for the Swiss tribunal to step in. So it's not, strictly speaking, like a normal court where decisions are precedent for future decisions. Okay. So that's just what CAS looks like, but now I want to talk about this extremely important case of DUTEE Chand. Roughly, what me and my co-author think is that people don't quite understand how important this case is for athlete rights. We think this case is way more important, and we're going to like really dig into it. Next semester at the College of Charleston, I teach a course on gender in sport. This decision is almost 200 pages long. My students have to read the whole thing. Oh yeah, a whole court decision. It's very dry. But for philosophers, I kind of suggest that you read this because the reasoning in it is terrible. It's really bad. They're judges. So DUTEE Chand is an Indian sprinter who, her national federation, so the Athletics Federation of India, tested her endogenous testosterone. So people thought she was a little too masculine, and then they tested her self-produced testosterone levels and found that she has a condition that we call hyperandrogenism. So she has elevated testosterone levels. And the IAAF has a policy where if you're above a certain level of testosterone as a woman or female, you are not eligible to compete. So she had too much testosterone, so they said you may not compete anymore, and then she took him to court. So the question presented to the Court of Arbitration for Sport is, are the IAAF's hyperandrogenism regulations discriminatory against women? That was the question. And then about 4 different arguments were presented. I'm not going to go through all of them. So how could she make this argument? There are 3 different things she could do. She would have to show that this policy, the hyperandrogenism policy, is in conflict with one of 3 things. First, she could show that it violates the IAAF's own constitution. Every international sports body has a constitution. Just like a nation, you could say that this policy violates their own constitution. Second, she could point to the IOC Charter. So you could say, look, this is an Olympics eligible sport, so even though this is the IAAF, you are still sort of under the control of the IOC, even though it doesn't violate IAAF constitution, it does violate the IOC Charter. So she could argue that. Or, like I said, because the IAAF is housed within Monaco, she could point to Monegasque law and say that this violates Monegasque law. Okay. Sorry, I keep forgetting not to drink seltzer when I'm talking. Okay. So, with respect to the laws of Monaco, there is a rule that all appropriate measures be taken to eliminate discrimination against women, including within sport. So she could argue, quite plausibly, that this violates Monegasque law. But that is the weakest of the arguments. Okay, she can go farther. One of the interesting things here is the shifting of burdens of proof. So she has to try to make this argument. The athlete always has the initial burden of proof. Sports federations don't bring cases against athletes. It's always athletes against the sports federation. So the way that court cases always work is whoever brings the suit has the initial burden of proof. So the athlete here, DUTEE Chand, has to make a prima facie argument that the hyperandrogenism regulations violate either the IAAF Constitution or the IOC Charter. And the IOC Charter is the easier argument, and it's the one they focused on. So the interesting thing here is all parties. So Chand obviously thought that the policy violated the IOC Charter, the IAAF agreed that it violated the IOC Charter, and the IOC agreed that the policy violated the IOC Charter, right? They all prima facie, oh yeah, obviously this is discriminatory. But the question is, can you justify the discrimination? Right, so prima facie is just, at first glance, are you discriminating against women? And even the IAAF is like, oh, of course we are, right? This policy only applies to women, that's discrimination. Obviously this is prima facie. But they think they have good justification for it, okay? So there's this shifting burden of proof. DUTEE Chand says, this policy is discriminatory, here's some reasons. And the IAAF's like, yep, but now the IAAF has the burden of proof to justify the policy. And this is really important because there's so little empirical evidence, which I'm going to get to in a moment, that whoever ends up with the ball in their court is going to have a problem. So there are 4 conditions for justifying prima facie discrimination within an international human rights framework. 2 of them kind of go together, so it's really 3. So the first is you have to establish that a policy is in service of a worthy social goal. So in this case, the hyperandrogenism policy is in service of the worthy social goal of fairness in sport. And everyone agrees that fairness in sport is a worthy social goal, so the first part is satisfied. In fact, that's a really easy hurdle to satisfy, right? Things like the death penalty. It satisfies a worthy social goal of, safety, public safety. Now, it fails the other stuff, but that first hurdle is really easy to clear. So it's not special that it clears this goal of worthy social, or the hurdle of worthy social goal. The second part is much harder. You have to show that the policy is both necessary and effective at promoting that worthy social goal. So that's where things like the death penalty usually fall, right? So the question here will be, okay, fairness in sport is a worthy social goal. Is excluding high testosterone women necessary and effective at doing that? That is the big question that we're going to be focusing on. The final one is that you have to show that the harm to the discriminated against group is proportional to the social benefit of excluding them. So we'll finish there. I'm going to argue that it passes the worthy social goal test, fails everything else. Okay, but I'm going to focus on the necessary and effective part. Now, in this particular instance, because the IAAF has the burden of proof at the end of the day, and there is relatively little empirical evidence about the connection between endogenous testosterone and performance, that we think the IAAF was like bound to lose. Just the structure of this case made it very hard for them to win. Okay, so in terms of the court's decision about whether the IAAF could meet their burden about justifying the discrimination, I hope it's not a surprise that they could not meet that burden. They were given 2 years to resubmit new evidence to justify that burden, and like I said, there's dispute about whether they made it or not. We're going to talk about the study that they use as submission and then just rip it apart, and that's going to be fun. Okay. So here's the core argument that I'm going to cover. So first, I'm going to demonstrate that according to the IOC, sports participation, by which we mean competitive sports participation, is a human right. Right? This is why we're using the human rights framework for this. Second, I'm going to show you that they no longer participate in the practice of sex verification. So they no longer have a test for whether you're male or female. They don't do that anymore. They used to. Third, they treat gender as your legally recognized gender in your country of citizenship. We're going to talk about problems with that. Fourth, it is just a fact that trans women can be legally recognized as women depending on the country that they live in. Fifth, the exclusion of any woman, trans, cis, intersex, based on high endogenous testosterone is discrimination based on natural physical trait or characteristic. Right? It's not like doping. You're not taking something to get this. It's just, it's part of who you are. Then we're going to talk about, I'm going to establish that the IAAF made this really interesting argument. They don't think that excluding high endogenous testosterone women is about whether you're female or male. It's a distinction between an eligible female and an ineligible female. Right? So they're going to say that the testosterone policy is just a female-female eligibility policy, but what we're going to argue is that any such policy fails to be necessary, effective, and proportionate, okay, which are the three main requirements for justifying discrimination. And that produces the conclusion that no endogenous testosterone limit on women can be justified ethically. Okay, that's where we're going. I'll stop halfway through to breathe, because there's a lot that's about to come. So first, I wanted to establish that sports participation is a human right, and the way that we do that is by drawing on the IOC Charter, and right in the beginning, after like table of contents, is the principles of Olympism. And two principles are important for our purposes. The first is number 4, and it says, first sentence, the practice of sport is a human right. Okay, so that's done, right? Okay, we can move on, right? Practice of sport is a human right. What's important, though, is that the IOC means competitive sport. When they say sport, they mean competitive. The IOC is only a competitive institution. There is no recreational Olympic sport. It's always competitive. So when they mean sport, they mean competitive sport. So competitive sport is a human right. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind and in the Olympic spirit, which requires mutual understanding with a spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. Okay, that's the 4th principle. The second principle that matters for us is the 6th principle, and this is the non-discrimination principle. So it says, the enjoyments of the rights and freedoms set forth in this Olympic Charter shall be secured without discrimination of any kind, such as race, color, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So there are two things I want to point out here. The first is the inclusion of discrimination on the basis of sex. Increasingly, different jurisdictions, nationally, regionally, are deciding that gender identity, so trans status, is already protected under sex discrimination. So for example, both the US and Canada, increasingly the UK, different countries are already saying that your being a trans person is already protected status under sex. Even though this doesn't say gender identity, they're saying it's already in the concept of sex. Even if you don't buy that, this is a very good policy because it includes or other status. This is not an exhaustive list. So you can't say, well, gender identity is not in there, so clearly it's not covered. Well, the or other status is there on purpose. Okay? So you can argue that gender identity is already protected under the IOC Charter in one of two ways. Okay. So the first point I wanted to make was that sport is a human right. The second point I wanted to make is that the IOC and other international sports bodies are no longer in the gender verification tests. So what we mean by gender verification tests is a few decades ago, if there was any question about what your sex or gender was, they would do a chromosome test. And if you had, and this is how the test worked. If you had a Y chromosome, you were not a woman. Like, it was that simple. It was not if you are XX, you're a woman, if you're XY, you're a man. It's just the mere presence of any Y, you are not a woman. It was that sort of simplistic. The problem is there are all kinds of intersex conditions where there are women, and we're not even including trans women, there are intersex women with a Y chromosome. There are also men with XX chromosome. So they finally realized this in 2015, no, 2003. It was 2003 where they're like, oh shit, this doesn't work. So they replaced it with a testosterone policy because that's better. So they said, okay, intersex people, chromosomes don't work. So anyone who has more than 10 nanomoles per liter of endogenous testosterone is not a woman. Okay, then in roughly 2015, they remade the policy and said, okay, that doesn't work either. We're not going to say that you're not a woman. We're just going to say that you're not an eligible woman. So they moved away from, we're not in the business of determining what sex you are. That's sex verification. We don't do that. We're just going to determine whether you are an eligible or ineligible woman. That's all they cared about, okay? So they don't do sex verifications anymore. By the way, pre-chromosomes, they're like, what are your genitals? Show us. It was very crude. Okay, instead of doing sex verification, they just said, look, whatever your country says your gender is, that is your gender. That's just what we're gonna do, because we don't want to be in the business of trying to determine. So in the Chan decision, they say whether a person is female is a matter of law. And what they mean is whatever your country of citizenship says is your gender, is your gender. And further, the distinction between male and female is a matter of legal recognition. Okay, they just want to be out of that business, which is good. Good job. Here's the interesting thing. To quote, they say, as noted above, there are only two categories of competition, male and female. These categories are together intended to cover all athletes who wish to participate in competitive athletics. So it is in this Court of Arbitration for Sport decision that sport is binaristic. There are male and female athletes, and these categories are meant to cover every athlete. You are one or the other. That's it. And if you are not female, then you're male. If you're not male, you're female. But if you're female, you're either eligible or ineligible. There's no such thing as an ineligible male, by the way. There's eligible, ineligible female, and then just male. We'll talk about why. Okay, this is really going to matter in about 15 minutes because what we're arguing is if sport is a human right, then the burden to justify excluding someone from sport altogether is very high, and they cannot meet that burden. So if they hadn't have said this, they might have had a better time trying to justify this, but as soon as they wrote this, and like I read this, I'm like, oh, this is a problem. You've got a problem. In fact, this is going to drive a lot of our conclusion that any countries, like we're going to talk about the different countries and their policies, we sort of think that this forces the IOC to adopt the world's most progressive gender policy. So whichever member nation has the most progressive gender policy, and I'm going to show you that Canada kind of is. Look, I'm Canadian, but it's not because I'm Canadian. That this sort of, look, it's binaristic, it's meant to cover everybody, and it's a human right, and you're going to exclude people from a human right. Wow, you've got a high burden. And they can't come anywhere near that. Okay. Now, they were not convinced. So Chand tried to argue that, look, there are countries where effectively an athlete's gender is whatever they say it is. So it's a self-identification policy. And CAS was like, yeah, you can point to a couple countries, but who cares about them? Right? It's not a big enough pool of the world's countries that allows such a progressive policy, so we're not going to worry about that. We want to suggest that they did not take this point seriously enough. So, like I said, I want to talk about Canada, because the requirements to change your gender in Canada is not a federal thing, it's a provincial thing, so there are different provinces with different rules, but 2 provinces started, and now it's more than 2. Ontario and British Columbia, that's a British Columbia and an Ontario birth certificate. Neither of those are real. Both of those provinces allow you to change your birth certificate sex with a 3-sentence letter from your lawyer. I am so-and-so's physician. They have told me they are this gender. I think that is appropriate for them. So basically, a doctor, a physician says, they say they're a gender and I believe them. You can get your birth certificate changed, you can get your passport changed, you can get your driver's license changed, you can get everything changed. You are officially that gender to the government of Canada because you said so and a doctor believed you. That's it. That's all it takes. You do not require hormone therapy. You do not require any form of surgery. Okay, so the CAS said, yeah, but like, you know, it's only a couple countries. Okay, Canada's kind of an important Olympic country. They hold the Olympics there fairly often. So Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, and Toronto keeps begging for it. So you're regularly, whatever, every 15 years, 16 years, having an Olympics in this country. You can't say its policies are not important. And what that means is one of the major member nations of the IOC can have athletes doing self-identification and competing, but other countries cannot. That's not fair. Also, whenever you look at like a medal count, Canada is usually top 5, right? So it's an important Olympic country. It's not just, hey, Canada. It's that it has this place in the Olympics. Also, some states in America have a self-identification policy. And you can't tell me the US is not an important Olympic country. Okay, so you have these really, really important Olympic countries effectively with self-identification policies. CAS kind of just dismissed it as a possibility. And we think that was a little too quick. Okay. The 4th point I wanted to establish is that trans women can be legally recognized as women. Would you like to see my passport? I think that's a very easy point to prove. QED. Okay. Some of these are easy. Some of these are slow. Okay, now I've already mentioned a couple times that there are inconsistencies in different international policies, and that it should not be a matter of luck in terms of whether you get to compete or you are excluded from sport for which nation you were born into. That's not fair. And the IOC is explicitly an organization to promote fairness and sort of civic well-being. Right? So they're meant to be a progressive organization. So if they are effectively punishing unlucky people from repressive countries and effectively rewarding lucky people from developed progressive countries, they're not doing their job. Okay. So like I suggested, we think that the IOC has kind of forced its hand with this decision to adopt whatever the most progressive policy is in the interest of fairness. I mean, they don't agree, but that's what we think. Okay, so look, we're halfway. Time to breathe. Because we're halfway through the points, but not the talk. Okay, so I want to talk about the ways that we discriminate in sport already on the basis of natural physical characteristics. Because we do. We do this all the time in sport, and we don't think it's a problem. So there are lots of sports where we discriminate on the basis of natural physical characteristics. For example, weightlifting, boxing, judo, all kinds of sports where we say there are weight categories. With respect to junior versus senior, we discriminate on the basis of age. Discrimination is a neutral term. Like, we typically think that it's only the negative connotation. Discrimination just means separating people based on some characteristic. So we discriminate all the time, but we think that making a 90 kilogram person lift against a 50 kilogram person is ridiculous, because the 90 kilogram athlete will win every single time. That's not fair. So we think that there are conditions under which discriminating based on natural physical characteristic like weight is perfectly acceptable, right? So I don't want to say that just because you're discriminating based on natural physical characteristic that it's not okay. It certainly is. But one of the really important things with respect to these weight categories, there is always a greater than category. So in powerlifting, for example, for women, there is a 90 kilogram plus. In boxing, there's always the top category plus. So you cannot be too much of a natural physical characteristic to compete in any of these categories, unless you're a woman with high testosterone. High testosterone is the only natural physical characteristic for which we exclude some people from sport. That means if it's the only one, and we can show that there are bigger advantages from other natural physical characteristics that you permit, then you cannot show that this is necessary and effective at promoting fairness in sport. That's the nutshell. So that's where we're going. I'm going to go into some wonderful data to show you that there are other natural physical characteristics such as height that confer much larger advantages than we can attribute to high endogenous testosterone. And if that's the case, it's neither necessary nor effective. Argument over. But of course, I'm going to show that's even worse for them. Okay. This is where I want to do the detour, though, through some philosophy. I want us to think about what is fairness in sport. Just take a moment. Like, what do you think fairness in sport is? Don't tell me. So normally when I give this talk, it's in North America where the sort of linguistic overlap is really, really tight. So I don't know if the phrasing will be the same here. How many of you thought something like level playing field? How many of you thought something like playing by the same rules? How many didn't think anything? Thank you for the honesty. Okay, so typically, at least in North America, when I ask people what do you think fairness is, by far the number one answer is the phrase level playing field. So it's actually hard to pin down the etymology of this phrase. Some people attribute it to the stock market in the 70s as the first usage. Other people attribute it to a very literal meaning for football, that the pitch is level, so it doesn't give the home team an unfair advantage. So the idea behind the level playing field as a concept of fairness is that the conditions of play are the same for everybody. Everyone plays by the same rules under the same setting, right? That's what fairness in sport is. Okay, so if that's what you mean by fairness in sport, why do you have a problem with trans people competing? Because they're playing by the same rules, using the same equipment, using the same courses, right? It's fair. And then you tell people this who don't like trans women in sport, and they're like, oh, well, that's not what I meant, okay? So once you show people that it can't be something like level playing field, they might think, oh, it means equal chance of winning. So a competition is fair if every athlete has an equal chance of winning. People have said this, don't snicker. But this can't be right, because any one-on-one competition would turn into a coin flip. Any 6-person race would be like rolling a die for who wins. And that doesn't seem right, okay? We don't think that sport should just be chance. It should come down to things like skill. It should come down to better training, tactics. In fact, I have 2 coaches that I pay every month for the purpose of unleveling the playing field. I try to have better equipment sponsors to unlevel the playing field. I try to ride with the fastest helmet, the better bikes, the better wheels. We think about what tires to use and what tire pressures for which tracks, right? My nutrition, my sleep schedule, whether or not I go for a fun ride to see the sights. We think about all of these things to make me have an advantage over my competitors, right? The whole purpose of sport is to unlevel the playing field. So level playing field cannot be what we, or equal chance of winning cannot be what we think of as fairness in sport. So those are generally the top 2 intuitive answers people give, but now we can talk about a few of the philosophical answers that people give. And there's this family of views due to Sigmund Lowland and Coggin, Hammond, and Holm, I'll just say Coggin et al., where they view sport as a cooperative venture in a social union. So contract theory type stuff. So what Coggin et al. Say is that an athlete may benefit from being allowed to participate and in exchange surrenders liberty to the extent that his or her fellow athletes agree. So fairness in sport is up to mutual agreement by the athletes, and that you give up some of your personal liberty in order to participate. So there are rules in sport. I cannot use a motor on my bike. That is a rule. But I have given up some liberty to play by those rules that limit me, right? So I don't get to use the motor, which would be awesome. So I've surrendered some personal liberty, and we've all sort of agreed to these rules, and that's what fairness means. Okay, so they continue. We may therefore conceive of taking part in sport as the consensual participation in a game with agreed binding rules that are known from the beginning. This means that it can be fair to treat participation differently so long as it has been agreed to by all the players. So this agreed to is the theme of this contractualist way of thinking about fairness in sport. And then the second person is Sigmund Lowland from his book, Fair Play in Sport. I was talking to Axel earlier, and I taught a course on sports ethics where I wanted to really think about this issue of fairness in sport. So then I taught this book I hadn't read before. So I've read it now. And what he is arguing is that we should think about norms or guiding principles of sport and participation, and that we should think about this norm about choosing norms. So this meta norm. And this meta norm for how we should think about the rules of sport, so rules about picking rules, is that we should choose rules and principles no one can reasonably reject as a basis for unforced informed general agreement. So this idea that fairness is choosing rules that for a sport that no reasonable person could disagree with. Right, this is the most prominent view of fairness in sport in the sports philosophy literature. I want to say that no. So, just to recall from Coggin et al., it's so long as it has been agreed to by the players. From Lowland, it's no one can reasonably reject. I hope most of you are interested in like feminism, feminist philosophy. Hopefully some of you are already thinking about this, that the most important question to ask as soon as you see this is, who is the we? Right? What are rules that none of us could reasonably reject? Because when people deploy this thinking, and I've had a very public fight with USA Cycling over this, like in Bicycling Magazine, which is the #1 trade magazine for cycling, is the way they think about like trans athlete policies is, but what will the other athletes think? Like, it has to be a policy that they will agree with. But the trans people are never included in the we, right? So if it's policies that everyone has to agree with, how are you going to get trans exclusionary policies by including trans people when everyone has to agree? Like, it's just not going to happen. So this agreement by all cannot be the way to think about this. Interestingly, both of these groups are drawing on RAWLS for how to think about social contracts. And the problem here, of course, is they are screwing up RAWLS. They're doing RAWLS so wrong. Because what they've effectively argued is for the tyranny of the majority. Right? If it's everyone has to agree to it, but we don't include the discriminated people, then you've got the majority who are dominantly situated screwing the marginally situated, which is exactly what RAWLS didn't want. Like, it's the opposite of RAWLS, but they're like, RAWLS. Here's the thing. They use RAWLS up to but not including the veil of ignorance. Anyone who knows RAWLS is like, you literally can't do that. Okay? So if you don't know what the veil of ignorance is, I will explain it. The way that RAWLS wants to think about fairness in society is he says, what policies would we agree to as self-interested rational agents if we don't know who we are? So the way the sports people are thinking about it is, you know who you are, and that doesn't matter. But for RAWLS, it's everything. So he says, let's imagine that we're all sitting in a circle, and somehow, like the movie Men in Black, I've got a zapper who can drain away your knowledge about who you are. So you don't know your gender or sex, you don't know your race or sexual orientation, you don't know your age, citizenship, you don't even know where you are. You don't know that you're in Germany. You don't know your education, socioeconomic status, you don't know whether you're able-bodied or disabled, neurotypical or not. You know nothing about yourself. You're just a rational, self-interested person who knows what types of people exist in the world. So you know there are disabled people, black people, you know there are disabled black people, you know that there are gay people, you know there are some straight people, those poor souls. So you don't know who you are. And now we're going to ask, what policies would you agree to knowing what type of people are out there, and that for all you know, you are one of them? So he thinks that we won't adopt policies that would violate basic human rights, because for all we know, we might have just voted for policies that harmed us when we strip away the veil and we find out who we are. He thinks no rational person would do that. So, RAWLS certainly doesn't talk about trans people, so I'm sort of putting this into his framework. A person may agree to trans exclusionary policies if they know they're cisgender, but that same person will not agree to that policy behind the veil of ignorance. So if we're supposed to think about fairness in sport as what will we agree to behind the veil of ignorance, we will not agree to trans exclusionary policies. But Coggan et al. Thinks that we will, because it's everything but the veil of ignorance. But if you're going to do Rawlsian justice theory, the veil of ignorance is absolutely everything. His theory does not get off the ground without that part. So to say we're doing RAWLS except this means you're not doing RAWLS. You're seriously screwing it up. And for philosophers to do this is, to me, ridiculous. So the way RAWLS thinks about things is that rational self-interested people will not gamble with basic human rights. For example, while he doesn't talk about it, participation in sport under the IOC, first sentence, is a human right. Rational people will not gamble with that. Rational people will not agree to trans exclusionary policies. Okay, so now let's talk about this policy. What are the reasons for excluding women, whether cis, trans, intersex, with high self-produced endogenous testosterone? So the claim is that men's performance on average is 10 to 12% higher, faster, stronger than women's. And that we can primarily attribute that to testosterone levels. Men on average have 5 to 10 times as much endogenous testosterone as women on average. And so they're saying men have higher testosterone, This seems to be the biggest difference between men and women. That's why they're performing better. Therefore, it makes sense to limit women's participation based on high testosterone, because then they will have this unfair advantage over other women. So we have to exclude them for the interest of fairness. The implication here is that any competitive advantage of about 10 to 12% is unfair. That's what they're saying. So I want us to take a literal minute and think about just how different women's bodies are in sport. They are all over the map. Sports select for different types of bodies, right? The physics of sport determines what types of bodies will excel. So I want us to talk, for example, I don't have my laser pointer, but this person right here is a gymnast, and this person here is a high jumper. So let's think about those two athletes. So let's say that they both want to be gymnasts. The short woman, all things being equal, has way more than a 10% advantage over the tall woman. Because the physics of tumbling are such that you need compact bodies, the way that gymnastics works is actually you want to be 12 or 13 years old. You want to be very, very young. And the problem with this is that that wrecks bodies. So the Gymnastics Federation had to put in a minimum age to be a gymnast because you want to be so small. And the reason you don't see many older gymnasts over like 20 is because they kept growing and they got too tall. So that tall gymnast will not even be competitive at a city level. Like, she's so non-competitive that it's way more than a 10% advantage for the short woman. But now let's do high jump. The tall woman is generally, elite high jumpers can jump above their height, because the physics of high jumping is bizarre. So the way it works is doing the Fosberg flop is if the bar is up here, their center of gravity stays below the bar. So what they're doing when they move is they're changing their center of gravity so that it goes under the bar the whole time. It's nuts. You're like, how is that possible? But it's possible. It's crazy. So they can actually jump slightly higher than they are tall. But not much, like a couple inches, which means that short woman is screwed, right? She barely touched the bar where the tall woman is jumping, okay? So height in almost every sport is more determinative of performance than endogenous testosterone. Take a sport like cycling. I am big for a cyclist, like really big. Not so much for a track cyclist, which is what I do because my longest race is 750 meters and we don't go up at all. But I used to be like a professional road cyclist, and we go uphill, and the physics of going uphill is not friendly to big people. So I was basically, anytime we did a mountain stage, dead last, if I even finished. But if it was a very flat course, so that pro race of the picture, the finish is downhill. It's so downhill that, like, you're going so fast, you're going about 65, 70 kilometers an hour, that weight helps when you're going down. If you think of bobsled, for example, they put a maximum weight on the team plus sled. So the weight of all the people plus the sled has to be under a number. This is why, like, cheating in bobsled is putting weight in the sled. That's how you cheat, okay? Because when you go downhill, weight is good. So people look at my results, for example, and they're like, look, she's winning and she's like the highest category in B. It's unfair. Like, yeah, because I race flat courses. And you look at all the hilly courses, dead last. In fact, the day after that win was a very long hilly road race. Less than a half mile in, I was out of an 85-mile race. So half a mile in, because the climb is right there, I was waving goodbye. And I was alone for the next 4.5 hours. It was hell. So different sports select for different bodies. And the type of body you have is a massive advantage for that sport. So let's look at a sport like rowing, for example. We can track over time the increase in height in the Olympic medalist rowers. So way back here in the 70s, you can see this clear trend line going up and quite sharply. So, for example, a friend of mine has a gold medal from 1992 as a rower. She's 6'4" and wears 3-inch heels because I love taking pictures with her. They are tall. If you look at elite volleyball players, the average height is 6'3" for women. So I'm 6 foot. Sorry, I just smacked the mic. I'm 6 foot. I am non-competitive in volleyball because I'm too short. I'm too short for basketball, right? Sports select for different bodies. And if you have the right kind of body, you have a massive advantage in that sport, a hell of a lot more than 10%, which is what we're saying is too much advantage. However, other sports aren't so selective. Elite marathoning has a fairly wide range of heights that can be competitive. All these people are champion marathoners, and they're relatively different heights. What marathoning selects for is very tiny ankles and small leg bones, right? Because the mass of a pendulum, the less mass you have to swing, particularly at the extremities, is an advantage. There is a disproportionate number of elite runners from one particular tribe in Kenya, because that particular tribe has a genetic predisposition to tiny ankles. So they just have less mass to move, and having less mass in your foot makes you an elite runner, provided you train like everyone else. And they have a massive advantage. Is it unfair? No. But we permit that. But we're trying to say that we can't permit the advantage based on testosterone, which seems much smaller. Okay? So here's what the Court of Arbitration for Sports said. They said, while a 10% difference in athletic performance certainly justifies having separate male and female categories, does it? I don't know. A 1% difference may not justify separation between athletes in the female category, given the many other relevant variables that also legitimately affect athletic performance. So really soon I'm going to talk about the actual data that we just got last year. And the guy who did the study was the expert witness for the IAAF, saying we must separate out hyperandrogenic women. And they're like, the judges asked him, so like, what's the advantage that we can attribute to testosterone? He's like, we don't really have the data yet. And they're like, take a guess. He's like, 2-3%. So that's in the testimony, 2-3%. And then they said, whoa, that's not enough. Like, you need to bring us the data. If it's 1 to 3%, no, you can't discriminate. If it's 10 to 12, okay, we'll look at it. But his like best guess at the time was, I don't know, 2 to 3. And that was the kicker. That was the point where the court was like, okay, we're done. Okay, no. Okay, so as I suggest, the IAAF's own testimony, based on this data set from the Daegu, South Korea IAAF championships, I'm blanking, I think it was 2011. So what they did is they took samples from every single athlete at that World Championships. And they tested them for endogenous testosterone, every single one of them. You cannot test for your natural testosterone through a urine test. Like a drug test will not measure it. A drug test measures whether it's exogenous, doping testosterone, but not your natural levels. So they tested all the natural levels of all the men and women, about 2,000 athletes. And then last year, they finally published the data. But what he was saying in the testimony in 2015 is they had collected the data but not quite run all the analyses. Is he's like, well, based on this data, it's maybe 2 to 3%. Okay? I'm going to show you the data because it's out now. So here it is. I'm not going to make you read that. But before you read it, think about what sports in track and field do you think it would be an advantage to have high testosterone? Jumping, sprinting, throwing, right? Power sports, okay? And you would think it might be a disadvantage for distance sports, right? Because you don't want lots of, I can't run to, like if there's a bear behind me, maybe, but the smaller people will outrun me, okay? So if there's a lion, I'm screwed, a bear maybe, okay? So you would think testosterone's not good for distance, but it's good for short stuff. So here's the data. Now, this study is so messed up. What they did is, okay, first, So the women's average endogenous testosterone levels is 1.2 nanomoles per liter. The units don't matter. 1.2 plus or minus 0.7. That's quite a large range, like one standard deviation being 0.7 out of 1.2 is kind of big. The average range for men is sort of 10 and up. That's the average. Okay. For pregnancy, for women, when they're pregnant, that can triple or quadruple your endogenous testosterone. So if testosterone were so important, then the first few months of pregnancy would be like doping. I mean, you are kind of putting a thing in your body, but they don't do that, right? So maybe they're not so serious, but hey, that's natural. But like being born with high testosterone isn't. 1/8 of the men that they tested were below 0.23 nanomoles. So the average for women was 1.2. 1/8 of world championship level men were way below that. Also, in this study, there is zero relationship in men between testosterone and performance. So men with high testosterone did not do better than men with low testosterone. Zero relationship. And that is like buried in a paragraph. Oh, by the way, no relationship in men. Moving on. Okay? So one, that there's 1/8 of elite men at like below the women's average should already be like, oh, so testosterone can't be necessary to exclude. It can't be if elite men can be that competitive. In fact, what this is saying, their policy is if you are legally recognized as a woman and your testosterone is below 10 nanomoles, then you can compete. So you could give a man who does not identify as trans, who already has natural testosterone at 0.23, like a passport in female, and he can just compete right now. That seems wrong, but he meets the policy. Your policy's stupid. Okay. So the second thing that's dumb about this study, they won't release the data to us. So one of my friends was the expert witness for Chand. She studies basically testosterone as an endocrinologist and a scientist. She studies the effects of testosterone on performance. And we've talked about this study, and they've tried to get the data from these people, and they will not release it. What they did here, these numbers represent the differential between the top tertile and the bottom tertile. Tertiles are thirds of data. Now, if any of you have ever looked at like population data, no one separates it into thirds. They separate it into quintiles, fifths. And they won't show us the data. So our honest guess is that if you separate it into quintiles, there's no effect. So we think they separated it into the units that show an effect, which is shit science. And they won't release the data. And we've asked for it because of this problem. So we've got some shady shit. It gets better. So because we don't have the data, this averaging that I've done doesn't make sense. Like that's not a legit number, but because we don't have the data, what can we do? So I averaged out all the running sports, and the average advantage was 0.28%. That's not 10. I averaged out the running sports, and it was 1.14. That is also not 10. In fact, when the Court of Arbitration for Sports said 1% would not be enough to justify discriminating, okay, so it gets better. It always gets better. 100 meters, 100-meter hurdles, 200 meters. The highest testosterone people did worse. High testosterone was a disadvantage. But we thought the power sports, like sprinting, there'd be an advantage. It's utterly counterintuitive. Now, we see with the 400-meter hurdles, 800 meters, there's an advantage. The IAAF, a couple months ago, just released a new policy where for those sports only, they are lowering it to 5 nanomoles per liter because of this study. Because they found an advantage in those sports. And this paper only talks about those sports, those events. it ignores, it doesn't discuss at all any of the negatives. It only cherry picks out the highest positives. Bad science. Okay, remember I said that distance sports, you would think that there would be no advantage? The marathon showed a 3% advantage. What the hell? But I want you to look at the data on the running side and notice that you couldn't have predicted where the numbers would be, positive or negative. So what does this suggest? No relationship, because that's what randomness looks like. So when you have, if we all flipped a coin 10 times and then we counted up everyone's results, we would be randomly distributed around 5. But some would have 8, 7, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. We might get a 0, we might get a couple 10s. We don't know, but they would be random around 5. This looks really random around 0, which would mean no effect. Okay, let's look at non-running sports. You would think, again, power sports like throwing, jumping, or whatever would be the biggest advantages. And you're like, oh, discus and hammer and shot put, holy shit, those are throwing sports, and gosh, look at hammer and shot put. Once again, Berman cherry-picked those. And he's like, see, testosterone we must exclude. Okay, have you ever seen javelin? They're big, right? They're throwing this thing 80, 90 meters. Disadvantage. Triple jump and long jump are usually the same athletes. One is positive, one is negative. Once again, it looks pretty random, pretty close to 0. So the study itself looks janky. They won't release the data. They did it as tertiles. They cherry picked only the positives and didn't discuss the negatives. They didn't do any averaging. But here's the best thing. The IAAF and Berman and his co-author thinks that this proves we should exclude women with high testosterone. They think this is like, we got them. The funny thing is, I started giving this paper last July. This paper came out in September, 2 days before I was giving a version of this talk. And I very hurriedly had to have the person who makes my slide make these slides, because I'm like, they just made my argument. Because I'm trying to argue that excluding athletes based on high testosterone cannot be necessary or effective for fairness in sport. Things like height and weight are okay. And the advantage is nowhere near the 10 that they're trying to argue. So thank you, Berman, you made my argument. Okay, so that's it. That's the bulk of the argument. I want to finish very quickly with the proportionality requirement. So in order to justify prima facie discrimination in terms of international human rights, you have to say that it's in service of a worthy social goal, it has to be necessary and effective at promoting that goal, and the harm to the discriminated group must be proportionate to the social gain. So the thing is, intersex and trans women, particularly from the global south, like India, for Duty Chand, is historically the most marginalized group there is. So if you're going to put more harm on an already marginalized group, the benefit to society had better be massive. And the benefit to society by further harming trans and intersex women is next to nothing, if at all. So this policy fails everything. It's not necessary or effective, it's not proportional. So our claim is, if it's not these things, then a limit on endogenous testosterone should not meet the justificatory burden of being prima facie discrimination on the basis of a natural physical characteristic. Therefore, no endogenous testosterone policy. Okay. So, because my co-author is a lawyer, the last thing I will say is that she thinks it is at least possible that instead of agreeing with us, they will make a separation between types of trans and intersex women. So they might say, okay, trans women on hormones but not surgery or whatever are okay, but everyone else not. Like, she thinks there is wiggle room, but they would have to make some seriously shady arguments to get there. But she wants it on record saying that they could. So there it is. But there's the argument. Sport's a human right. They don't do sex verification anymore. Gender is considered legally recognized gender. Trans women can be legally recognized as women. Discrimination based on natural physical characteristic has those requirements. And these female eligibility rules do not meet those requirements. Therefore, no limit on endogenous testosterone. Thank you.